Some people suggest that progress is an impossibility. We haven't done that in the past, so we can't do that in the future. This sentiment is so very often the essence of their view. If we listened to these people, we would still be dwelling in caves. The logical conclusion of their irrational aversion to progress is an eternity of an existence that is characterized by a primal and animalistic state of affairs. The modern world was a utopian fantasy for most of human history. Highly complex, large-scale political organization, democracy with universal suffrage, the rule of law, human rights, limits on the power of government, secularism, and much more. Things are far from perfect, but we have made a lot of progress, and only a fool would deny it. Every idea is a utopian fantasy until it isn't. You think there wasn't a time when massive, highly complex political organizations, characterized by democracy, universal suffrage, the rule of law, human rights, limits on the power of government, and secularism, were regarded as a utopian fantasy? You think the modern world would not sound like a utopian fantasy for most of human history. Think again. We should be realistic. We should understand our limits and our nature. But the pessimistic will for a societal stagnation is an irrational cancer. The irrational aversion to progress, which can be found in the appeal to history and the appeal to nature, is just that, a desire for a stagnant society. A will which, if followed, would have condemned us to an eternity spent as cave-dwelling creatures. This will to stagnate, this desire for stagnation, is so often the pursuit of people who have been massively privileged by the will to progress. A lack of appreciation for past progressions is baked into it. The will to stagnate creates a self-fulfilling prophecy by which progress is made into an impossibility. Nothing makes progress impossible quite as effectively as the idea that it is. When we believe that progress is impossible, progress becomes impossible. The desire to become a slave to the most vile parts of one's nature and/or to tradition characterizes so much of this aversion to progress. The utter weakness on display is sickening. The acceptance of something horrible, societal stagnation, for such poor reasons. The abandonment of one's agency and rationality in favor of being dominated by the worst aspects of one's nature and/or tradition. Is this not the will to slavery embodied? A display of pure irrational weakness. The accepting of a defeat that there is no reason to accept. Surrender long before the battle is lost. This inability to exercise agency and control over the worst parts of one's nature. This acceptance of domination by the worst parts of one's nature. This cowering at the very thought of challenging tradition. This assumption that there is no better way of doing things than how they have been done. It is the embodiment of a primal animalistic irrationality that belongs in the cave-dwelling times which this thinking would have condemned us to. Few lessons are abused and misused more than the lessons of history. But if history teaches us one thing, it teaches us that political progress is not a utopian fantasy. It is a concrete reality. Those who make idiotic arguments against progress are not realists. They are irrational morons.